the 1890s. That's why the building that we know as Beecher Chapel was originally First Congregational Church, whereas First Church had kind of an unknown identity, although it was more congregational than anything else. In the 1890s, Old First Church and Beecher Chapel, or First Congregational, merged to create this extraordinary structure. That is real Romanesque with the bark on, evidenced by the rusticated stone, these arches over the doorways, the towers. And this, surprisingly, was designed by a pair of local architects, a couple of guys named Gottschalk and Beadle. Obviously, they were influenced by Richardsonian plan books, but they nonetheless generated a structure of great magnitude, which I'm sorry to say is awfully difficult for the current congregation to maintain. This is no longer the dominant church in the community. There are something like 115, 120 giving units in this church, providing hardly enough income to pay the preacher, much less to keep the place tuck-pointed or to keep the roof from leaking.
What's the current dominant church?
Probably First Presbyterian, which would suit Reverend Gale just down to the ground. I guess we're all caught up. The public square, which is now a circle, but it's been a square and a circle numerous times before, was originally intended to be the center of Galesburg. South Street was to be the south boundary, North Street, which we'll walk up to, the north boundary. The west boundary was not West Street, but Academy, and the eastern boundary was Seminary. The square was right in the middle. Never worked out that way. When the railroad came through in 1854, obviously it pulled all the business down toward it. And so the public square became kind of a backwater. It never has been at the center of things, and there's very little in the way of business to the west of the public square. Again, I got here almost too late to be a habituary of the BV, but I was there a couple of times before it burned. It was in the first floor of the Broadview Hotel, which was actually a venerable old structure that dated from the 1870s. It was originally the Union Hotel. There was a barber shop in the basement. If you're interested in trivia, Carl Sandburg used to sweep floors in that barber shop that was in the basement of the Broadview Hotel. Another one of the original tenants of the Union Hotel was John W. Burgess, a name which may mean something to you if you took political science courses at some time. John W. Burgess taught at Knox College briefly in the 70s, went on to Columbia University, where he helped found the discipline of political science. When he was living in Galesburg, I can't remember the particulars, but he was the guardian of Eugene Field. Now, you know who Eugene Field was. Another Knox alumnus who was around here for a couple of years.
Can't compete with that.
We're going to have to put up with that all afternoon. Field was a real hellraiser when he was a student. He was constantly pulling pranks on the faculty, the administration, and his fellow students. Didn't go to classes much. He was a real trial for John W. Burgess. Burgess went for a walk one afternoon in January of 1871. He was carrying in his pocket, for whatever reason he never did explain, a security that he had that was worth $5,000. While he was out walking, the hotel burned down. That burned up essentially all of Burgess's belongings in Galesburg. He no longer felt much of a tie to the place, other than Eugene Field, but Eugene Field was shortly to turn 21. Burgess said, "Fine, I'm leaving town." He left, took his $5,000 with him. Field left shortly after. So there are enormous connections with various kinds of Galesburg early denizens in that hotel, which has since been replaced by that totally undistinguished place that started out to be a Howard Johnson's.
Oh, yes.
It's changed its identity 3 or 4 times over the past 30 years. The building to our right, which is now the Frameworks, the temporary occupant of that building is the Frameworks, was originally the auditorium. It was a major theater and a major stop for theatrical and musical performances of a variety of types. Galesburg had a rather active entertainment life as long as people traveled by rail. Lots of people changed trains in Galesburg. This was also true of entertainment companies. It was not at all inconvenient for them to put on performances here. Carl Sandburg shifted scenes in that building. But this is the original Illinois National Guard Armory, which has recently been sold to the city of Galesburg for $1. Of course, nobody knows what to do with it now. It's awfully difficult to find an adaptive reuse for an old National Guard armory. We're open to suggestions, so if anything comes to mind, let us know. We've got a couple of things to talk about here. Behind us is Galesburg's second railroad. Nowadays, unromantically called the Chillicothe Division. We know it as the Santa Fe here in Galesburg. But the turnover of reporters on the Galesburg Register Mail is always so substantial that we get people who don't know anything about the community or its history. And so they call it the Chillicothe Division, but everybody knows this is the Santa Fe. The Santa Fe was brought into Galesburg as a result of the very aggressive activity of a local mover and shaker named Clark E. Carr. We'll have more to say about him later. He sat on the platform, I'll say this much, he sat on the platform with Abraham Lincoln at Gettysburg in 1863. He was kind of the political boss of Galesburg for a number of years, for as long as he lived. When he found out in the 1880s that the Santa Fe, which stopped in Kansas City, was going to build east to have an outlet to Chicago, when he found out that the original survey was going to miss Galesburg by 12 miles to the south, he went down to Topeka, which was the headquarters of the railroad. He and the committee that went with him promised the Santa Fe the sun, the moon, and the stars, tax abatement, free right-of-way, all these goodies, if the Santa Fe would build through town. Our case was persuasive. The Santa Fe did build through town. It made all the difference in the world. It substantially reduced freight rates in and out of Galesburg, and it made possible the manufacture of certain kinds of materials, certain kinds of items that cost down the transport, like brick. The substantial East Galesburg brick industry dates essentially from the arrival of the Santa Fe here. As we all know, the Santa Fe merged with the Burlington half dozen years ago. It's now part of the BNSF system. There's a tremendous amount of traffic on this line. In fact, I'm not sure how many trains. I have seen as many as 100 a day being estimated. If you live close to this line, that means an awful lot of trains and an awful lot of railroad noise. And it is an aggravation. I think we have to admit that, because these are trains that are going through town. They're not stopping here. They're not benefiting the local economy one bit. They make a lot of noise. They block a lot of traffic. It's hard to know what the solution is. Aside, perhaps with the construction of a few underpasses or overpasses, anything that we do is going to be terribly expensive. We're looking here. This rampaging rivulet is Galesburg's link to the sea, Cedar Fork. If you start walking down Cedar Fork and keep going west, you'll end up in the Mississippi River, but you may have to do a lot of portaging. I used to say that we are so located here on a prairie upland that a drop of rain that fell out east of town on Farnham Street, if it broke in half, one half would end up in the Illinois River, the other half would end up in the Mississippi. Cedar Fork, before it was paved, was essentially a kind of open sewer. Sewers from the north side didn't come under, well, they came underground to this point, and they just kind of dropped into to Cedar Fork, and it was hoped that the creek would kind of flush things out and everything would be okay. On the other side of the Santa Fe was an enormous horse and mule barn, which also contributed some effluent to Cedar Fork. And it's said that Santa Fe passenger conductors, when trains came into Galesburg, advised the passengers to roll the windows up because it smelled so bad to stop here. All that changed after an enormous, well not an enormous, but a substantial flood in 1927. Cedar Fork came out. It flooded some of the buildings on Main Street and some of the structures along the tracks with perfectly noisome affluent. Where there hadn't been a demand for sewer improvements before, there certainly was after this. And Cedar Fork essentially no longer is an open sewer. The sewer is down underneath. The creek now is essentially a storm sewer, but the sanitary sewer runs subterraneanly. But we've been climbing Galesburg's only hill. We are at the peak of what in the 19th century was called Quality Hill. Quality Hill being the upland above the creek bottom. Here we are. And we're also at the north edge of the original town of Galesburg on North Street. And I think maybe you can get some sense of how dominant Old Main would have been, at least from this point, before all the trees grew up. If you were to stand out in the middle of Broad Street and look south, Old Main is what you would see as kind of the dominant structure in the community. The house that we're standing right in front of is the second oldest house in Galesburg. It was built for an early faculty member of Knox College named Innes Grant, who taught mostly mathematics and ancient languages. Everybody had to be versatile in those days. That house has been turned a little bit. It originally faced North Street, but it was turned 90 degrees to its right so that it faced on Broad Street. It's interesting because it has a stone foundation. We're a long way from stone here. Most of it's buried by glacial till. You have to go over to the Mississippi River to find stone. Somebody must have quarried some stone around here in the 1840s when that house was built. That's 1840 is about the date of that place. Now, I mentioned early on that Reverend Gale was perfectly happy to have Knox College located on a prairie upland a long way from any place in particular. He thought that would preclude his young ministerial students from being corrupted by the influences that are to be found in worldly places like river towns. The world came to Galesburg anyway in the form of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. And precisely the very kinds of elements that he hoped that would be avoided came to town anyway. But Reverend Gale, whose farm occupied a good bit of the real estate north and east of here, managed to profit nonetheless by this intrusion of the world into his prairie idyll. He subdivided much of his property into town lots, made a lot of money, did well by doing good, and in the process, I won't say he built this house because this happens to be the oldest house in Galesburg. It dates again from about 1840, but he certainly did well. I've heard it said that the weatherboarding of that house, the siding, is walnut, which makes a certain amount of sense because walnut trees were a drug on the market in and around here in the 1840s, 1830s. They were cut down to make way for agricultural space. They were used for fence rails, for firewood, occasionally residential siding such as this. Nowadays, walnut trees that frequently stand alone in pastures and that sort of thing sometimes get poached by people who are looking to make a quick buck. The house, when originally constructed, was rather close to Greek Revival in style. In fact, I think we can say that it's one of the only really nearly Greek Revival style houses in Galesburg. What makes it Greek Revival is that eastern wing there, which is built perpendicularly to the street. The front entrance is a little off center. If it were totally Greek Revival, that's where the The entrance would be in the center. But the unbroken cornice under the porch roof, that also suggests Greek Revival influence, and that unbroken cornice we also find just under the attic story. Galesburg really is too new a community for there to be too much in the way of Greek Revival construction here. The Greek Revival pretty much played out in this country in the 1840s and 1850s. The best example in Knox County is the old courthouse out in Knoxville, if you're interested in collecting architectural specimens.
What year was this house built?
1840. The house across the street with the red trim, it's just about the best example in town of what we call the shingle style in architecture. It's very wildly, exuberantly asymmetrical. You'll find the windows are of all different sizes. The siding, of course, is shingle. There's a wonderful porte cochere on the north side of it, and above the porte cochere there is an eyebrow window, which I'll ask you to look for as we keep walking north. This is a house that was owned until rather recently by Galesburg's most famous novelist, Robert Helliga. If you didn't have a chance to buy Helliga's novel, The Italian Lover, which was for sale at the Fine Arts Center this morning, you may be able to order one from the bookstore. I think Helliga sold out. I recommend the novel highly. The house across the street, the light blue house, was owned for years by Rick Ortner, who was chair of the art department at Knox. He's since retired and moved down to Baton Rouge. Why anybody would leave Galesburg for Baton Rouge, I guess is a matter to be decided by him only. But that's a beautiful example of the Queen Anne architectural style. Actually, most of these houses in this block belong to the Queen Anne genre. And the Queen Anne houses tended to be wildly asymmetrical. The door was always off to one side. Strange dimensioned windows. Notice that keyhole window to the left of the front door. Lots of interesting fish scale shingles in the cornice up there. Lots of interesting ornamental sheet metal work laying underneath the cornice. Rusticated foundation. The brick in that foundation was made in Galesburg. It's called flint brick, and it was a particularly hard kind of brick, practically indestructible. You'll find that in a lot of old houses in Galesburg. The house next door to it was built in the 1890s by John Houston Finley, whom I mentioned earlier as the first modern president of Knox College. He came to Galesburg like he intended to stay. He built this rather pretentious house. By 1899, he was gone. He was back east. He had big ambitions. He ended up as editor of the New York Times when he died in 1940. And the brick house across the street with the mansard roof is one of only two examples in town of French Second Empire style. What identifies it as Second Empire is the mansard roof, the rather peculiarly shaped dormers that look out through the mansard roof. That wraparound porch, I'm sure, came later. That isn't part of the French Second Empire style. But there are other distinguishing elements, like the coins, the limestone coins that are located at the corners of the walls, and the very heavy stone hood molds over the windows. This is a very vertical house. It's one that's built to shed rain. It obviously needs some help, but it's owned by a couple who are committed to its restoration. I'm stopping here just briefly to point out that on this side of the street there are a number of examples of Queen Anne architecture in various states of, what do I want to say? I don't want to say disrepair, but they've been remodeled substantially, some of them. Some of them have them. Some of them have been very well taken care of. We want to stop it a little bit and take a look at a couple of them in particular. Now you remember I mentioned Clark Carr, the local Republican mover and shaker, who was able to persuade the trustees of the Santa Fe Railroad to build through Galesburg. He also managed to get President Ben Harrison to come to Galesburg to lay the cornerstone of Alumni Hall in 1890. Harrison made him American Consul General in Denmark while he was president. Carr came back after Harrison was no longer president during the Cleveland administration, built this house. It's probably the biggest house in Galesburg, certainly the biggest frame house in Galesburg. And I think you can tell from those rather remarkable dormers at the attic level that he was very much influenced by architecture that he saw in Denmark. It almost looks like he shipped those back in two pieces from Copenhagen. Otherwise, Queen Anne, obviously, wraparound porch, rusticated stone foundation, all kinds of windows, lots of curbs, lots of decorative sheet metal work. That roof is also, I think, sheet metal or turn or something of that sort. It's been kept in pretty good condition.
Oh no, of course not.
The house across the street was built in the 1890s by George Lawrence, who was a local attorney and also something of a land baron. At one point he owned over 70 farms in this immediate area. He did very well in his lifetime. This is probably the most pretentious house in all of Galesburg. That stone came a long distance to get here, as did those polished granite columns. It's again a beautiful example of Romanesque. Those stones that inside the arch leading up to the front porch look almost like teeth. It looks like the house is defending itself. That house remained in the Lawrence family until the 1950s, when it was deeded to the local school district, which used it as a headquarters for a while. After the school board moved out, the place was purchased by